Welcome, everyone. It's really exciting to have so many participants with us here today. Really exciting to have Andy here with us. We are going to go to him in a minute. I would like to start this meeting just by saying a few words about Innovationsledanra. We have some members that have been with us for quite a long time, but some members are new, and it's always good to just have a bit of freshen up what is the organization about. So I'm just going to share my screen here. Just a few slides that I want to share with you. I'm going to put them in presenter's note. Does everyone see the slides in presenter's note, hopefully?
Yes.
Super.
Yeah.
Very good. But well, as you might know, Innovationsledanra, we're a nonprofit organization, and the idea is really to gather the professionals working with innovation and innovation management, and that are driving innovation within the different organizations across Sweden. It has been already established in 2013, almost 10 years now. So it's very exciting. And it's really a really interesting mix of both companies, both private and public sector, and consultants and academia. So, a really interesting, vast array of different practitioners within this area. And as you might already know, also the three main driving lights for this organization is to help develop the profession, to establish this as a discipline, and to support the practitioners, support the members in driving innovation in their organizations. And we use this image so often, and I still think it's a great slide to just kind of show the rise of innovation management as a profession that people see. Okay, this is something that we need to have in our organizations. This is not just something that someone does as a sidekick project, but that organizations are empowered to work in innovation management, just like the same or similar route as project management, as quality management in the past. There's a lot of things that the organization is working on, the body of knowledge, so training, job description, all different elements that contribute to this idea of innovation managers as professionals. And we are also working across Sweden in different regions. So if you are based in any of these locations, join the local nodes, invite friends, colleagues to these nodes. And if you're interested in opening up nodes in other parts of Sweden, please feel free to contact us and let's do this. I would like to also I would just like to also point out some of the key activities that we have. We have the meetings for the members. We have the mentoring program that the applications are open. I'm going to go back to that for a second. The thematic meeting groups, please check them out. Personal certification program. We have the innovation leader event that is actually just coming up. We just have the winner announced very recently. The job description, the body of knowledge, and just feel free to join us, check out our calendar and our social media to know about the activities. Right now, please, 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 please join us in the mentoring program. I have been in the mentoring program for quite a few years now, and it's an amazing experience. You really have the opportunity to engage in helping other organizations develop their innovation management capabilities, and you learn so much, both as a mentee, but also as a mentor. You learn so much about other organizations. So please just reach out to us and make sure that you apply. 31st of December, do not wait until the last date. Just make sure that you apply us in our website, innovationsledanra.se, mentoring. these are some of the mentors that we had in the past, but we had so many others. But the idea is really about diversity, learning and practicing innovation from many different perspectives. And this is us, Innovationsledanra. So now that we kind of made our sales pitch, it's time to move to, well, the reason why we're here, Andy, is really to hear all about you and your work and amazing presentation that you have for us. I just want to say a few words about Andy for those of you who haven't been checking him out on LinkedIn, which I'm guessing everyone has. He's the head of coach network at Strategyzer, which is such a big reference for everyone working on innovation management and in design. So it's such a pleasure to have you here. And I was asking Andy some time ago when we had meeting to prepare for this event, and I was asking Andy, you know, something interesting about him to kind of kickstart our conversation today. You know, there's nothing like starting a friendship with a life-threatening experience event, and Andy has a quite interesting experience with elephants. Do you want to tell us more, Andy?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So thanks for the ask. Thanks for having me join. It's just an absolute thrill. Yeah, I was traveling in Nepal, and I had the opportunity to be staying in this compound. And one morning, super early, there's this commotion, and we get called out, and the guides locally say, "Hey, there's this whole thing happening over here." They run us over to this paddock, this huge paddock with this stone wall, about a 4-foot stone wall surrounding it. And in the middle, there's a female elephant that was part of their compound. And this wild bull elephant, this enormous giant elephant, had come charging in to visit the female, and they didn't like that. So they were making all kinds of noises and trying to get rid of this elephant. And it was just a remarkable thing. And finally, if I recall correctly, this was about 15 years ago, I think someone shot off a gun, not at the elephant, but in the air to startle him. And he came charging right towards us. And this stone wall was like nothing. He just folded the wall and then kept charging off. And it was just an incredible way to start a day. Very thrilling way to get going. And as we're walking back to the compound, we're all saying, man, this is, imagine what we would be doing if we were at home. It wouldn't be this, right? So it was a pretty cool way to start.
I'm guessing you did not need morning coffee that day. Probably
no.
The adrenaline was high enough.
Absolutely.
Super. Thank you so much for being here with us. It's such an honor, really. Just to be clear a bit about the rules of the game, we are going to have time in the end of your presentation for a small Q&A, correct?
Sure.
And it would be great if there's questions coming up throughout the presentation, if the participants could just write them in the chat, you know, so we don't forget. And if I see, I'm going to be a bit your mod for today. If I see something, you know, this is really worth picking up right now, so that we don't, you know, so that we clarify this immediately, so we don't let it kind of fall between the cracks, then I'm just going to pick it up directly. Otherwise, we can also just pick up the questions later on during the Q&A.
Yeah, that sounds great. And of course, there's a whole room full of experts. And so by all means, let's open the floor as we're exploring all of these thoughts and ideas and get insights and inputs from everybody. That's one of the things that this type of engagement using the technology that we've got in front of us enables is exactly that. We can share it through chats or just unmute and ask a question. I think it's a small enough room for us to do that in a manageable way.
Yeah, absolutely. Super. Thank you so much. Please.
My pleasure.
Take it away.
All right. Well, let me share my screen. And if Fernando, you can just confirm that you're seeing the right.
Yeah, super. Brilliant. Very good.
Terrific. So, as I mentioned earlier, talking about a thrilling way to start the day, this is just as thrilling. And I'm so excited to be here today, talking to everybody about the culture of innovation. And of course, everything that I'm talking about today is all predicated on the work of Alex Osterwalder and the rest of the Strategyzer team. Of course, Alex has been building out on these ideas for many, many years and is without a doubt a seminal expert in this space. And it's a real thrill and an honor and a privilege for me to be able to work with Alex and the rest of the content creation team. So all the concepts and ideas and images and visuals and design that I'll be sharing out today are all developed by Alex, and of course can be found in this book if you don't have it already. I'm not here to sell books, but if you are interested in the concepts that we're talking about today, this is a real manual of ideas when you think about the way organizations approach innovation from all perspectives, very much including the perspective of innovation culture, right? So something to keep in mind. Now, of course, we're living through a monumental and unforgettable time in history, without a doubt. But I want to bring us back about 355 years to another very memorable, huge moment and tragic moment in history. And this is meant to depict the Great Fire of London. And many of you may know the story. Devastating tragedy, right? A fire that swept through London, wiped out about a third of the city, 13,000 plus homes, I think something like 87 churches, all just burned to the ground. So a real horrible experience. And as the citizens of London started to think about rebuilding and coming back on, the city planners of London and the monarchy got together and said, look, this happened. This is a real tragedy. And maybe there's an opportunity here. Maybe there's an opportunity to innovate, to look at the way that London has been built, identify those things that we didn't really get the most out of, weren't really efficient. And maybe there's an opportunity for us to undo some of that work and recreate London in a new way, in a new innovative way that works better. So they threw out a call to the architects of the time. Let me just see if I can get this to advance. And they had great responses from some of the biggest names. We've got Sir Christopher Wren, Sir John Evelyn, and a few others. And they put it up to say, okay, what would your design look like? And so my question to the group is, which of these designs ended up being used by London city planners? And so Fernando, if you could open up the poll and everyone just select which one they think. Now, for all of us who've been to London, which is probably pretty much everybody in the room, we know they didn't do D, right? They didn't go with the grid, that's for sure. You know, I live here in Toronto. We're pretty grid style, right? So I love it when I go to Europe and get completely lost within the first, 10 seconds. So what are the thoughts? We've got a couple. We've got, we'll give it another few seconds. I mean, you may even be recognizing some of the structure in London. So A seems to be a winner. Let's give it another 3 seconds. C's coming in as a second place. All right, perfect. Let's wrap it up there, Fernando, if you want to close the poll. So A is the big winner. C came in second. Let's see who's right. Let's move to the next slide. Well, the reality is none of them. So in the end, what the city planners did is they rebuilt the city pretty much exactly as it had been built. They made slight alterations just to create some different access to waterways, because they obviously learned that the hard way. But they went back and defaulted to the exact same thing that they had done the first time. They backed off. And so you can speculate forever about why. What was it that caused them to do this, this reaction when they had this opportunity and they didn't take it? Well, one thought is this notion of fixed versus growth mindset. So when we're in a scenario, in a situation that says, look, this requires a new way of thinking, it's so critically important to be aware of the mindset that we bring and alter that mindset to open up to new opportunities. So that's just a theory. But when we think about when we're stuck in a fixed mindset, which happens often, more often than not, the cause of that reaction is predicated on fear, right? So we're always in some relationship with fear. And I say that as an always, it's a very binary statement to say that's always the case. But it seems that it's very common that there is this ongoing relationship that we have of some fear, right? So we think about now being in the situation where we have an opportunity to do something new, to do it differently. it's very common for a fear to come up. So if you have a thought, plug it in the chat as to a fear of what might have been going through the minds of the city planners and perhaps even the monarchy when they thought, hey, we're going to do this differently. We're going to go out there. Well, one word that pops to mind for me for sure, and likely did for others, is risk, right? So there's a fear of risk is really deeply ingrained in folks. Typically there's a fear of change, right? Because when we do things differently, well, what's at risk? We might lose something, right? There might be some loss. And underpinning everything, and I can't see the chat, I don't know if anyone shared anything out, but I would imagine this is a thought that really comes to mind for people, and it's definitely prevalent when we think about innovation and the culture of innovation, and it's an enormous fear of failure, right? This is something that is a long line thread that runs through a lot of the work. So when we're thinking about mindset and we think about scenarios that work and scenarios that don't, oftentimes we can point to this as being a real important player in really guiding what's going to happen next. And this resonates through organizations of all sizes. We see it, and I'm sure you do as well. I would love to hear some input. Anything come up in the chat room that's different from some of these words, Fernanda, that is...
I think there's an interesting point here from Per. He's saying, you know, repeating what is already in place, it's kind of already approved. So you don't need to deal, I'm guessing as I'm interpreting, you don't need to go through the hassle of, you know, getting the buy-in from others. It's already kind of there.
Absolutely, it's the work. And then when we think about the work, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, and I'm making a leap, Pat, and I don't know if this is what you meant, but there's potentially a connection to rewards and recognition, right? So if we think about what is our why, what is driving us every day to do the things that we're doing and show up, well, it's predicated on some return, right? It could be intrinsic, it could just be something that makes us feel a certain way, or it could be extrinsic, it's a reward that we get, compensation or so on. And if we can't square those two, then it's oftentimes it's an easy response to say, well, why are we going to do all that? It seems like it's so much extra. And maybe we don't need to, and maybe me as a decision maker, I don't feel motivated and driven enough to do it. And this sounds like we're vilifying people making in these positions to make these decisions. And that's not the case. It's really just the human nature, right? We have a tendency to take the easiest path, right? That's the way we're designed. Anything else that pops up?
Yeah, I was also thinking here of the comment from Stefan. He's commenting something like, according to research, we fear to lose something that we have. For example, the status that you have, the power, etc. So I'm guessing it's a bit connected here to the fear of failure, but also fear of losing what you already have somehow.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's the anchoring effect, right? So as soon as we have something, it becomes part of who we are. Even though if it had happened just before we've gotten it, we wouldn't have noticed. But as soon as we have it, it becomes, you know, part of how we're defined, right? To some degree, and that can change. But it's the same thing with income. If we have some material possession, if we have a relationship. And then, of course, I think underpinning all that is this sort of primal response to say that if we start to lose our stature, and you mentioned that, that's a fantastic point. There is a connection back to, again, this primal response to say, am I in or out of the tribe, right? So if my status starts to decrease, what happens to me? What happens to my livelihood and my future and maybe my safety, right? So those things are not necessarily as extreme today as they were millions of years ago, but all the research and fantastic stuff for bringing that in points to the fact that we're still wired, right? We still have that lizard brain that creates this reaction in us, and it's really hard to override. Even though we can take all these inputs and say, well, hang on a second, you know, we're living in a society that doesn't necessarily respond that way. There's still this reaction that sits within us, and then that creates reactions and interactions that do fit with society. So it creates this veil to say, well, this is normal behavior, and it's still potentially fueled in a way that has been part of the human reality for millions and millions of years. Well, let's move on to the next point. But you know, we think about the fear of failure, and there's certainly no lack of desire, though, right? On the surface of it, right? Organizations all around are saying, yeah, of course we want to innovate, right? So McKinsey did the study, got 70% of executives to say that innovation is a key piece of their strategy. I kind of think like what happened to the other 30%? I mean, shouldn't innovation always be reacted to as, yeah, of course, that's an important part of the strategy, but regardless, we see that there's a lot of uptake in this notion, and it's intuitive, right? And yet it's not working, right? The results aren't there, and we get this reaction in a microcosm. Of course, they did this poll on a large scale. We work with organizations on a regular basis, and we see this all the time. Largest scale, multinational corporations saying, yeah, of course we want to innovate. And of course we have an engine of innovation, not waiting for the Strategyzer team to show up and go, hey, have you thought of innovating? They're already doing it. But what we do hear a lot of is, yeah, we're doing it, and it's not working, right? So, we talk about innovation programs, and where are you potentially doing innovation theater? You're talking about doing it. You've got all the right things, and you're actually executing on certain things, but you're not really getting it to work. It's not in the end working. And then even what's the definition of working? Like, what does that mean? What does success look like when we're thinking about innovation? So that is what brings in the main challenge. So how do we address it? Well, there's a framing that we think is important. And again, you'll see this mapped out in the Invincible Company, where we think about corporate identity, who we are. We think about a portfolio management approach, which is likely familiar to many, if not all of you, and that's about what we're doing. And then the culture. So how are we going to do it? What is the environment in which we intend to do this work? Now, the focus for us isn't going to be about corporate identity, but we're going to talk about portfolio management and, of course, really center in on culture. But I'd like to start with thinking about the what we're doing, right? So, as I think it's important to kind of set the table, thinking about the big picture approach that organizations take towards innovation that really amplifies the importance of having the right culture. Because you can have the greatest plans, right, best laid plans, but if you don't have the right environment to do it in, it's going to continue to fail. And that's why we really highlight that. And obviously the work that you folks are all doing, this is I'm really excited about getting some inputs from you to see what's happening in your experience. And so we bring in this statement. So to build an invincible company, and invincible company, we mean organizations that think ahead, right? That compete on business models, that are trying to see around corners, to quote Rita McGrath, and really designing a way of building business models that scale, or at least exploring for business models that can scale ahead of time before it's too late, right? And so to do that, the notion is the need to create, manage, and harmonize two antagonistic cultures under one roof. Now, that's a provocative word, antagonistic, but there's a lot of truth in that. There's a lot of tension that exists between the explore side and the exploit side. And that's, again, we're not going to spend too much time thinking or talking about this, but it brings in this notion of the explore exploit continuum, those two elements that exist under one roof. And we think about it from a culture perspective. A culture of explore is all about cultivating that process of discovering idea, like ideating, trying to find new ideas, and then running some discovery to test those in the market, and then validate those, and then ideally accelerate those into into ideas that can actually scale, into business models that can scale. And the point is that these ideas are new to the organization, right? That's one of the fundamental elements of that. And then on the exploit side, it's really about nurturing existing process and really staying embedded in that, and just really cherishing the processes and rituals that exist, and the kind of, here's where we say, well, we're doing that because we've always done it that way. Now, again, not to vilify this side. I mean, exploit, of course, is critically important. We have business models that work, and we continue to work in them, and we continue to innovate within those business models. We can get iteratively better over time by increasing efficiencies, which is a good moment to remember that there are three types of innovation as we look at it. And our framing is, there's different ways that different sort of thought leaders, frame this out, but Alex and the team have framed it this way, is that on the exploit side, we think about efficiency, and then there's sustaining innovation, and there's transformative innovation. So to help illustrate that point, we'd like to bring in Amazon, and we're going to talk about Amazon a couple times throughout this. And listen, there's a lot to be said about the culture that exists in Amazon, but I am thinking very specifically, of course, about the culture of innovation. And from that lens, hard to say that Amazon doesn't get it. They really do things really well. And so an example of efficiency innovation is automation in the warehouses, right? So that's taking their existing business model, right? retail and making it better, right? And it makes it better certainly from a customer experience in terms of turnaround. This is how you order things in the morning and it's there by the time you're finished breakfast. You've got much fewer errors and so on. So really game changing on every level in terms of what they've done on a warehousing perspective. An example of sustaining innovation is the Kindle. So it's adjacent to the business model. It's trying to say, well, it's trying to enable additional sales within the existing business model, as well as creating an additional revenue line through the sale of the devices. So again, definitely additive, but nothing game changing in terms of the business model. And then of course we have Amazon Web Services. Now there's transformative. Here's where they went to their key resources box on the business model canvas. I'm sure that's what Bezos did, as he started there and said, hey, we've got this thing. How do we build it into a brand new? And of course, that is exactly what they did, right? And how do we develop a new business model that absolutely revolutionized Amazon, right? And is now, of course, the main contributor of revenue for these folks. So a really good example to show that lay. So again, it's not about saying that exploit is there's anything wrong with it, right? It's just making sure that we understand the differences. So if we come back to the portfolio map and we think about on the exploit side through the cultural lens, well, what does it look like to be in a mode of exploit in this space? Of what are the actions and the activities? Well, folks are really driven to finding the right idea, executing on the plan, delivering the results, avoiding failure, right? We've already talked about that fear of failure, and predicting the future based on the past. So it's all about, let's continue to do this. It's very structured. It's very conservative, right? We don't want to reach out and take a lot of risks, but we do want to get ahead of this fear of death and disruption, right? So that's how do we continue to keep our business model fresh, but we don't want to reach too far, right? We're still driven to the P&L. And so, that's the model that exists within the exploit side. Whereas on the explore side, it's all about looking for net new, right? It's about taking ideas and exploring ideas that are new to the business. And that does absolutely require a shift. And so just to expand on that for a second, let's talk about our friends at Bayer, which of course we do a lot of work with. And we were instrumental, in helping them build out the Catalyst Fund, which is a process that we do, and you're very likely familiar with, where we take a funnel of ideas, and in the very early stages, we do the work of de-risking that idea before we invest. So in the very early stages with the Catalyst Fund, and Henning Trill, formerly the head of innovation over at Bayer's, always available to chat about it. He's a real good friend of Strategyzer, very close friend of Alex's. So in the first phase, they took 74 teams. They gave them 3 months, a little bit of money, 10,000 euro, and a little bit of time. That's 1 day a week. Right away, we start to see the risk, right? You have people who work in a regular day job, and they're being told to, hey, look, put a day a week into this work. We can see potentially some constraints that are happening. But still, the notion exists that we want to, in the very early stages, invest a lower amount into these ideas. We see that the evidence shows that, on average, this is typically about the right amount. We've got about 60 to 70% of those ideas are determined to say, okay, it's not worth investing more into this. So we retire those ideas. We move to the ones that survive, go to phase 2. We give them a little bit more money, a little bit more time, and then we continue the process. And in this case, they found that 19 businesses came back as real return, right? So these organizations were creating some return. And in fact, embedded in there were a couple of pretty good blockbusters, right? So the revenue that was generated out of all of this work started to get up to sort of the billions, and Henning talks about that in a webinar that's available off of our website. So again, just an example to say this is the process to mitigate the risk, but definitely open the door to exploring net new ideas. And what happens when organizations don't follow this process? Well, here's one example, Quibi. Fernando, have you heard of Quibi? Has anyone heard of Quibi?
I have not. Anyone?
Yeah.
Does anyone have?
No, I'm seeing some shaking heads. That's the answer we always get, and that absolutely validates the point on this. So here's the story of Quibi. It was an app that you load onto your phone. It was meant to be like a Netflix killer, right? It was supposed to be the next Netflix. So the notion is these short stories, episodical, right? So you take a 5 to 7 minute episode of a big story. So like what we're used to if you're watching any show, it's episodical, but in a very small way. And the idea was to enable the mobile world, right? So you'd load this onto your mobile device, on your tablet or your phone, And while you're waiting for a train or in between meetings, you would just watch a few minutes. And the content was designed that way so that it created a different experience for you. So they had this idea. They had all the right players. Meg Whitman, formerly CEO of eBay and then Hewlett Packard Enterprise, Jeff Katzenberg, who is one of the biggest names in Hollywood. All of the right backers, including a whopping $1.75 billion in backing, right? So all the big producers out of Hollywood, all the big organizations had come together to put lots of money, all the right people in place. And then they just went out, and within 6 months, the idea was dead, right? It turns out, and I definitely, it resonates with me, and I don't know, I'd be curious to see what everyone else thinks. I'm okay with watching 6 or 7 minutes of some show, hitting pause and then going back to doing whatever I'm going to do and then picking it up. I mean, the premise was way too weak for what they were trying to accomplish. And sure enough, it died. And what a waste of incredible brain power and unbelievable amounts of money. And why? Because they didn't test, right? So there's one example of what happens. But I think about this and I wonder, was there anybody in the room that was like, hey, Jeff, Meg, I don't know, should we ask people? And, you know, was anyone doing that? Or, and this is all speculative, obviously I have no idea, I'm definitely not trying to demean anybody that was part of it, but maybe was there a lack of psychological safety that was present in the room, right? And in these multiple attempts, were there people that were putting up their hand and going, I don't know, guys, this is, maybe we should rethink, maybe we should not just rethink, but we should test. Let's go see if we can get some real hard evidence on this. And perhaps they were overridden, right? And so HBR comes back with a survey that says the #1 obstacle to innovation is politics and cultural issues. And again, I don't know about you folks, but my mind flashes to that, you know, so that boardroom, right? The being in that space and having the ability to really speak your mind, right? So that being so fundamentally important to how we design a culture around innovation. So let's now flip into, that's all the concepts and kind of those ideas. So let's flip into the actual culture map and start to explore how we work with organizations and how we use the tools to enable that conversation. So to make this happen, Alex and the team connected with Dave Gray, a friend of Strategyzers and certainly of theirs. And Dave Gray is an incredible visual thinker, and he really wanted to talk about culture, and he wanted to create this visual tool. So he got together Alex and Yves and Alan and said, look, help me build out this tool so that we can work with organizations to better understand how they're approaching their culture. And, you know, he's a big thinker. As you want to understand culture, you need to map it. And again, as a visual thinker, that automatically comes to mind for him. And so after all that work, we arrived here at the culture map. And of course, like all tools that we use in this space, it's very simplistic. It's all about the conversation that goes into it. So the culture map helps us understand what behaviors will allow us to achieve our ultimate outcome. So we're really thinking about behaviors, which is a massively complex topic, right? Because now we're really getting into the guts of how people work, really hard to navigate. And then of course, what are the outcomes? That's pretty straightforward. And then underpinning it, what are the enablers and blockers? And without a doubt, this is where it gets really juicy, right? Because we can think about the behaviors, we can automatically think about the outcomes. We almost immediately know what those are. We can have, you know, more conversation about the behaviors, but when we get into the enablers and blockers, here's where it can get personal, right? And here's where it becomes a challenge. And once again, here's where the tool really helps. I want to add in a frame that Dave brings into this, and I quite like. In fact, there's a webinar. I'm sure there's a number of him talking about this, but we have one where Alex and Dave talk about these concepts. So I'm pretty sure we have it on our website, or you can just Google it. Anyway, he says when you think about the enablers and blockers, for him, he creates this metaphor of a plant, and you know, sort of at the heart of it, of course, is the soil, right? So what are the nutrients you're giving to the soil? And those are the things that are going to either enable or block the growth of this plant. And then if you think about the behaviors, he makes this parallel to the plant itself, the way that it's growing. And I find that so interesting because when I think about plants growing, and we see this all the time, you see how a plant responds. The behavior of the plant responds to the environment, right? So we have, as an example, we have this huge tree at our cottage. It's enormous, and it's leaning over the cottage. This thing is probably, we're in feet, but say 60 feet, so I don't know, like 20 meters, I want to say. This is huge. And if it came down, it would be a problem. And it's leaning over the cottage. And so we actually had someone to come and take a look. And he's like, no, it's just looking for light because these other trees. So it's the behavior of the trees causing worry for us. But I think it's so interesting. And I think it's a really cool parallel to think about how that shows up in an organization, because you can see the behaviors of people and whether or not that's going to create a risk to the organization or not. And then of course the outcome is either the fruit that we're taking off of the plant, or if it's a flower, just to enjoy it, right? So I think it's a cool way to look at this and think about it. So how do we actually use and apply the culture map? It's pretty straightforward, right? So we identify some behavior. So the example we've got here is, yeah, we generate ideas in workshops. That's good. But that's a positive behavior. Here's a negative behavior. We're not actually doing anything with those. Here's an example maybe of where we're performing a little bit of innovation theater. We're talking about doing it. We don't actually explore the new ideas. And what does that result in? The outcome? Well, it's a lack of results, right? Pretty straightforward. And then now we get into the good stuff. We say, well, what is it? What's causing it? Well, the folks who are told to do this, these don't have the time. They haven't been enabled, right? So it's a really simple example, because once we've mapped what exists in the culture and what's working and it doesn't, we obviously now want to think about desired state, right? What's future state look like? A very simple thing here as well. We create official channels to explore new ideas. A simple concept, although I will say, much harder to do, right? I'm sure many of you are thinking that, yeah, sure. You need to say, oh, just make more time, right? Yeah. How do you actually do it? What needs to come into play to make that work? And I think that's where the conversation gets interesting. We're going to spend a little bit of time doing that. But before we do, I want to open up a poll. And I want to ask the group, and I'm sorry, it's a bit limited because, here, because we've got just some examples, and that'll show up in the poll, Fernando, if you want to pull up that one. What types of innovation blockers have you experienced either in the teams that you're working with, or perhaps for the consultants in the room, if you're seeing this happen for your clients and so on? And then if there's anything else that's burning for you that you say, hey, I've had this experience and it's really shown up as a blocker that's not in this list, please just either unmute and share or put it in the chat room. We'll give folks another few seconds to respond. And maybe even, again, if anyone wants to comment once we land with a final. How's it looking, Fernando? We feel with people still responding. Fernando, how about yourself? Has anything pop up for you?
It seems quite balanced, to be honest. I think that there's something really, at least from my own personal experience, there's something really about short-termism. This idea that, you just want to have results for the next quarter, or, if you're really ambitious, maybe for the next year. But if there's anything that goes beyond that, then it really is difficult to get any support for it.
Well, you're spot on. It's going to come up as an example. You're stealing my thunder, but yeah, you're absolutely right. No, that's good. It absolutely validates. And I think, like so many of these things, these conversations that we have, much of it is just validating things that we already know, right? So looking at these results, it looks like competing priorities. It feels like, yeah, we've got great. Thanks everybody so much for responding. You're right, though. It's pretty broad across the board. Competing priorities stands out. Are you able to share the results so that others can see it?
Yes, they're being shared now.
Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah, great. Thank you. So lack of experience, fear of failure shows up. Of course, we've talked about it. So yeah, I mean, those things. So no surprise across the board. And if there is, again, anybody who's got a particular example that they want to unmute and share out, please don't hesitate to do so. I think competing priorities really stands out when we think about going back to that notion earlier about that tension that exists between the sort of that two cultures, or the antagonistic cultures that exist within the organization. We don't want to enable the antagonistic sort of approach. It's just more about the reality of saying, look, we've got competing priorities, and the organization needs to do these certain things to thrive, and yet we want to make sure that we're balancing that effort with the work that goes into exploring for net new innovation. So thank you so much, everyone, for sharing out your thoughts. So now let's get into talking about how do we do this? So we think about the nature of the culture map is pretty straightforward. Well, how do we actually then engage? Well, here's something that Alex and the team have uncovered that really work. And this also with a lot of contribution from one of our senior associate partners, Tendai Vicky, who is very likely known to many, if not all of you, and if not, certainly encourage you to look him up. He is a tremendous thought leader as well. Published, he's got some terrific books. His most recent one, Pirates of the Navy, and a huge contributor to what we're doing, and also just a great guy to work with. He's a lot of fun. So we think about the culture of innovation, and we think it's important to look at it through these three dimensions. So we think about leadership support, organizational design, and then the tools of innovation practice. So how do we actually execute? So we're going to break each one of those down a little bit. And of course, it maps beautifully onto the culture map, and it helps us look at the each element of the culture map in a particular way. So here's an example. We're not going to go through all of the things that are plotted in here. And of course, this is just one example of what can show up for types of behavior that an innovation culture requires. But some things that are highlighted from the lens of leadership support would be an eagerness to invent and pioneer. So a real desire to map this into the strategic guidance of the organization. And some things, of course, when it comes to innovation, need to work top down. If the organization isn't committed to it, then at the executive level, then it's a non-starter, right? It's not going to go anywhere. So that's just one example. At the organizational design level, is this an option for people to think about innovation as a career rather than just something off the side of my desk? I'm part of product management or sales or something that says, yeah, you've got a connection, or part of the design guild or whatever it might be. And so, you should go and do the work of innovation. And people generally are creative, resourceful, and whole, right? So they've got an opportunity to build. We all do. And so it can be easy and tempting to say, hey, can you do this as well? Which is good. And there is a huge benefit to saying, look, how about a dedicated team of innovation? Alex has been talking about this a long time. He's like, we need innovation as a profession, as a certifiable profession. And that's certainly part of Alex's vision long-term, is to help build that out, to be one of the voices to help really build that out long-term. And it's certainly getting there. I mean, there's many, of course, many of you, no doubt, that is your profession, right? Is to think about innovation. And then the practice. So is there, as one example, a systematic way of measuring the work that's going in to reducing risk as we're exploring ideas, as one example, right? Because again, we can go through the process and go through the steps, but if we're not capturing it, then we're potentially performing innovation theater. We're saying we're doing the right things, but are we really creating any traction in this process? So that's an example of behaviors. And outcomes, it becomes really straightforward, right? So creating resiliency to change and disruption. So getting ahead of it, right? That's obviously something that really lands in the minds of senior leaders. Keeping the talent that you want around innovation is one outcome that we may target. And then of course, actual measurable reduced innovation risk would be an outcome that we'd be looking for through the lens of innovation practice. And then, we think about some of the blockers. And here's yours, Fernanda. So we're thinking about short-term focus, right? That could definitely be something that lands with senior leadership, and absolutely a blocker, right? I'm just going quarter by quarter. I'd love to think about what's happening somewhere down the road, because many innovative ideas really require long-term thinking. The majority of them do, but I'm really going to stay focused on short-term. What's the reward system? And if it's geared towards execution, it's really difficult, right, to get people who are intrinsically or extrinsically rewarded to do the work of innovation when they're every day kind of being beaten over the head with, did you make your numbers, right? And have you hit your KPIs? And then execution KPIs being the tool, right? And so when we think about enablers, let's switch our lens to that now. And I'm actually going to break down, we've actually categorized some of the key enablers that fall within each one of these dimensions. And I want to break them down with a little bit more detail. So when we think about leadership support and some of the key enablers, we do think about strategic guidance. So how have leaders integrated the thinking of innovation into their core planning? We think about then making and enabling that by actually providing resources. So money is one, but absolutely time, particularly large enterprises, I'm sure you've all experienced, can be the biggest challenge, right? Money is more accessible than time. And so, that's a huge challenge. And then do they really embrace this notion of the ambidextrous organization? And are they taking a portfolio management approach? And so a question that comes up around this, and I'm going to pose it to you folks, is how much time does your senior leadership spend on innovation every week. So Fernanda, you had a question in the opening about, do you have somebody in charge? And so then a follow-on question is, well, how much time do they spend? And either your CEO or again, if you are working with other organizations, what do you see in the market and in your region around how much time people are spending? So we've got people responding already. Terrific. And again, the patterns are kind of no surprise. I'm sure people are not going to be surprised by the outcomes of this. Seems like a little bit of a leading question, but I guess part of the thinking is if we just keep asking this question over time, maybe we will see this shift, right? From a very low number to a high number over time. That would be ideal. Things are still coming in. I think we've got the theme there, right, Fernando? It looks like it's pretty obvious as a clear winner, and it's less than 10%. So you can just close that poll, and so we see that, the majority of people said less than 10%. There's a decent number that's getting up to 10 to 25%. A few did say 25 to 50, and nobody said more than 50%. So no surprise. Alex did a similar thing. He's always posing these questions, of course, and he did this on his social media. And this actually, I think, almost mirrors exactly what we just had in this little focus group here. So it's typical, and it very clearly points at a big part of the problem. But here's a counterpoint. Bracken Durrell, CEO of Logitech, he does spend up to 60% of his time in innovation. Let's hear him speak about it for a few seconds.
To explain it, called trees, plants, and seeds. And trees, plants, and seeds was the really, really overly simplistic analogy that virtually any company that's been around for more than 10 years is doing, whether they talk to people in public about it or not. But this was mainly for us internally. So the tree was the big old tree, which was on its way to its deathbed, in my view. It's going to fall over and turn into lumber, was the PC peripherals business. The plants could be new businesses, and the seeds would be things we try to create that might be new businesses one day. It's really that simple. So we took 75% of the resources out of the plant business, which is PC peripherals. We kind of quietly inside the company, people didn't even realize that we moved them over into new things, project by project, into Bluetooth speakers, into tablet accessories, into what we call video collaboration, back into another PC business called PC gaming, which sounds like a PC business, but it's really not. It's a gaming business.
So 75% of resources from the old business. Now think about how empowering that is when you've got the top of the company, the CEO, referring to the core of the business, right? The lifeblood of the business as the old tree that's going to fall down and get chopped up into lumber, right? You're talking about peripherals. It's really creates an environment to say, yeah, absolutely, we can do the work of challenging our existing business model, exploring that new business models. In fact, he's got this sort of surreptitious plan where he's moving people without them even knowing about it into these new areas, and it's so exciting. So if we were to map that onto the portfolio map, we see his old tree business of the peripherals being driven down, the resources being drawn out of that through that plant business or the speakers, and then in the explore business looking at gaming. And in fact, I happen to have some experience with this. SciTech is the name of that particular brand that we've got here in the visual, and it's flight simulation software, and not software, well, it does come with software, but actual hardware. Incredible stuff, right? Game-changing stuff. And it's still within their environment, but it is distant enough to say, hey, this is a brand new space, right? Not trying to kill the peripherals, right? The peripherals can continue to go on, but that is something that is dated and changed, and what an enormous amount of competition. And of course, this video itself is a little bit old because even speakers we know is now ubiquitous, right? We've got speakers everywhere, and lots of it's certainly been commoditized. But the notion was there, and you think about it doesn't even matter. This is a snapshot in time. If you have that mindset, you have that culture that you approach with it really from a growth mindset, those will consistently change. If Bracken Durrell was here right now, he would map out something new that they're working on, right? And so that mindset is so incredible. One other example that we've got, of course, it is in the book, is coming from Satya Nadella, who talks specifically about this notion of growth mindset and the critical importance for leadership to approach things with this boundary-less and globally minded approach to seeking solutions. So let's drop constraints. Let's not create these constrictions around how we're approaching things and really enable a mindset. So again, if you have the top of the organization driving that message, it changes the temperature in the room and really creates that psychological safety to explore new ideas. And again, this is a case study that you can read in the book. When I think about mindset, I'm just throwing in this book. I don't know if anyone here has had the opportunity to read it. It is terrific. Carol Dweck is sort of the seminal, this was the seminal work around mindset and the shift of fixed and growth mindset. And she really has done tremendous work to help map that out and help us understand how not only does that show up for people, but then how do you potentially impact and change and shift your mindset. So it's a really good thing. And if we're talking about books, of course, I'm going to throw the Invincible Company back in there one more time. So we've talked about leadership. Now I want to talk about organizational design. Let's think about that. So has the organization been empowered? Are they legitimized in the work that they're doing? How have we connected those rewards and incentives? And it's coming back up over and over in the theme. And then is there's this bridge back to the core? And again, Tendai talks about this all the time and how there's so much danger, and I'm sure folks here have experienced it, where we lack that bridge to the core and we create what Tendai calls orphan ideas, right? So we've gone through all this work. We've created all of this, evidence around what an idea is and how it could potentially change and become a really critically important business model for our organization. And yet if the organization itself, the enabling functions within the organization aren't there ready to receive it, then that idea will die, right? And there's a variety of reasons why that could be. And an example that comes to mind is Eric Yuan. As you all likely know, is the story of Eric. So he was at originally WebEx, right? He started, he was one of the originals at WebEx. And then of course they got acquired by Cisco. And then at some point, I think in 2011, Eric goes to the senior, himself was an executive, he goes to the senior executive with this idea, right, for a web conferencing tool that sits on smartphones. And the short story is they said, no, right, we're not interested, right? Well, that's probably not exactly how it went, right? It probably was that all of these things that we're talking about, the culture, the mindset, just wasn't there. I am sure there were individuals who went, yeah, that does make sense, right? Like we should enhance WebEx to the point where it has that capability, but the systems and structures weren't in place, enabling them to say, yeah, okay, let's take this on, Eric, let's explore this idea. I mean, he did okay, right? He did okay. Of course, we're now currently using Zoom, valued now at $70 billion. Yuan's net worth, I believe, is around 16 billion. So yeah, he survived that experience of being shut down. But you wonder now, of course, without a doubt, Cisco and WebEx, looking at how that came to pass, it's a real indication again of the culture that exists in many of these large-scale organizations. It's not a personal thing. It's certainly not conceptual on the surface of it. Very easy to say, yeah, well, naturally we wanted to explore it. We just didn't have the ability. The enabling functions weren't prepared for it. Now, here's an organization that does do it well. Ping An. It's a Chinese insurance company that you may be familiar with. Insurance company that has evolved into a technology company. And they did it this way. They did it really in a smart way. They made a very conscious and intentional decision to expand the way that they work by including a real dedicated explore side. So Peter Ma, CEO, of course, has his organization, traditional, typical organization that exists under him. And him and the executive and the board put in place the actual role of chief entrepreneur. So Jessica Tan runs that part of the business. And it doesn't sit in some skunk work somewhere off, in the distance. Again, we're not talking about innovation theater. They sit side by side. They're as empowered, right? And this is where it really changes the game, right? And now she has an entire organization that reports to her. And again, she's fully integrated with the exploit side, the core business model. And so has it worked for Ping An? Well, here's a snapshot of their revenues over the span of 9 years. So yeah, I think it's worked. And not only that return from a revenue perspective, but the things that they're creating are really game changing, right? The Good Doctor is one of the apps that has changed the way that organizations, not organizations, but people embrace healthcare and the way they interact with healthcare. So there's really important work that they're doing. And of course, they're reaping the material rewards as well. So the last piece of it is innovation practice. And here we think about what are the tools, what are the processes, and how do we manage and understand those processes, and how do we work in the skills? So, you know, we talked earlier about having the right people in place, managing and driving innovation, and how do we know that we've got those right people, and how do we keep them? So this is a very sort of broad topic and has a lot of moving parts to it. But we've talked a little bit already about the tools of innovation and the way that we lay it out. Conceptually, and Alex has put this together, thinking about the corporate identity, who we are and what we're doing and how we're doing it through the portfolio map and the culture map. Of course, we bring in a lot of the traditional tools, the business model canvas, the value proposition canvas, the business environment map, which, you know, we think about as we think about a business model, and we think about the desirability, right? So the front stage of the business model, whatever it is that we're trying to bring to the market, do people want it? The feasibility of the backstage, can we do it? The viability underpinning the profit formula, is this something that we can continue to be profitable in and sustain as a business? And then, of course, the environment, right? Such an important element to say, what is the environment like for this business model? Is the time right? Or what are some of the threats that exist for this business model? What are some of the market forces that could come in and create some downward pressure on our business model? So those are all, you know, structural tools, of course, that we bring in. We think more and more about innovation metrics. And I will say, from our perspective, and perhaps when we open the floor, we'd love to hear how people are seeing that come about, because, you know, we talk all the time about innovation theater. We talk all about, you know, going back to those early statistics, everybody wants it, but is it working, right? What is it that we're going to do? And of course, we're seeing some fatigue start to come in, where organizations are saying, like, what are we going to do differently? How's this going to actually work this time, right? And so we think that metrics, there's a part of it, the answer that sits in there is like, well, how well are you tracking the work that goes into it? And then, of course, as you're exploring ideas, leveraging the things like the test card, at least the concepts that exist within the test card, extracting assumptions and generating hypotheses and deciding on experiments. What are we going to test? How are we going to know, right? And then what do we do with those learnings? What are the actions that we take coming out of that, right? So just a snapshot of some of the core tools. Now, when we think about the projects, and all of these tools, by the way, available, if you don't have them already at hand, you can go to our website or just Google them, all of them for free, download them. The project scorecard takes those concepts we were just talking about, ideas, you know, sort of notions of innovation risk, right? So desirability, feasibility, viability, and then adaptability. And we look at projects through that lens to better understand and map them on the portfolio map, so that we have a good understanding of what is the expected return and what is the innovation risk. So we're looking at KPIs on the exploit side. When we come over here into the explore side, what we're interested in understanding is, what is the risk, what is our expected return, and what is the investment, both in terms of dollars and in time, right? So we're going to use these tools to capture that information and that insight. As we're running experiments, I know this is kind of, there's a lot of data on the screen now, but, you know, we've got this ability to capture the insights that we're gaining from doing the work of testing ideas and running experiments, and then bringing that over and plotting it onto the portfolio map, so that we understand what is the potential expected return and what's the risk. So this example we've got here, it's a very high potential return, at least to the scale of this pretend organization that we're using here, and a very high innovation risk because it's early stage, but the potential return and a relatively low investment is hard to see. But we've got $5,800, and, you know, however we're going to continue to grow that investment in terms of the work that's going into the experimentation says to us, yeah, the formula spits out, this is worth it. Let's keep looking. Let's keep exploring this idea. So one example of how we're using innovation metrics to inform the activities that we do around exploring new ideas. And in this, underpinning all of it is this notion of, yeah, it's okay to fail. It's okay to come to a decision in there to say, even though we've invested time, even though we think that there's this large expected return, all the evidence is saying that this idea is a fail. Let's embrace it. And again, Jeff Bezos, love him or hate him, he's good at this, right? He really understands and really drives this concept, and you can see that in the output of Amazon. And then, so that's talking about projects, all of that to set the stage for this, how do we then measure the level of innovation readiness from a cultural perspective in organizations? So we're not going to obviously repeat all of the concepts, but this tool, again, available for free download, is intended to then enable the conversation within your organization or perhaps with your clients to look at these three lenses, three dimensions, and within each dimension, three lenses of innovation readiness, right? And then plot that. And of course, as you can imagine, perhaps some of you have already used this tool, the conversation that springs up around it is pretty intense, right? Because now you've got multiple people coming in with their response and their opinion and perspective on how the organization approaches each one of these elements. And it can get really, really interesting. And then of course, the output of that starts the conversation around, okay, well, where are the enablers and blockers, right? So now we're taking the output of this, putting it back on the culture map, and then understanding where that's working and where it isn't, and then ultimately doing some form of ideally co-design to say, okay, where are we going to go next, right? And so we go through each of these elements. And that brings me to my final thought around this whole notion of innovation and why are we even doing it? And one of the thoughts is with the right mindset, anything is possible. Let's see some examples of some of the things that are potential out there for people with an innovative mindset to build. I gotta say that last one I think is great. That neck brush, that kid looks so happy wearing it. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and for your contribution all the way through. And on that, would love to open the floor for thoughts, questions, things that folks want to share out.
Super. Thank you so much, Andy. What a great presentation. So much food for thought. I myself have been, taking notes, a lot of things coming up, but I think it would be great if we could just open the floor for questions, and, please feel free to unmute yourselves and maybe we can just have a discussion. And of course, if someone wants to bring something in the chat also, please go ahead and feel free to share. There's some, to get the conversation going, there's some comments now about, this idea of measuring things, actually, that if you measure something, then you can manage it, you can get it done. And this idea of being difficult to measure innovation sometimes. I don't know if you can say a few more words, Andy, about that, just to get us started.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, great comment, Marie, around what gets measured gets done. It is so true. And I think when we think about that notion of innovation theater, this is where it can go off the rails, right? Because then it moves from concept. Again, we can just go into it with the assumption everybody's going to agree we should do this. Everybody's going to agree with the outcomes and even the behaviors. It really comes back to focusing on those enablers and blockers. And I think that's one of the most important elements of, again, this simplified tool. It's a very complex conversation that comes out of it. I'm looking at Pontus's comment as well. A lot of focus on the CEO. Any recommendations for us at the floor? Pontus, perhaps if you want to unmute and just share more about what's happening for you and what's kind of driving that comment.
Okay, yes, thank you very much. No, well, I think that it's very many of these things are dependent on the CEO, but to get some things going, we also need to change the mindsets of the CEO sometime, or well, to get to make the CEO have a growth mindset as well, if you so to speak. So it's that's how do you go about doing these kind of politics or whatever it is?
Yeah, boy, what a great question, and an enormous topic, and really tricky, right? I don't think there's one answer, and yet it's such a critically important thing. Much of what we do, actually, and of course we're just one player in a very large field, is about trying to create that awareness. So triggering the thinking within leadership. So we have a process we call innovation insights for leaders, and the notion is if we can get, we leverage, of course, Alex, and the credibility that he brings, or Tendai, just to get an audience with folks to talk about what we were just talking about, and really gaining that sort of starting that conversation. Again, leaders aren't surprised by it, but what we do find, it can trigger some thinking to say, look, the risk and the fear, right, which is driving us to either inaction or action, there's that two-sided coin to say, yeah, I get there's risk in trying to do things differently, and there's just such enormous risk around doing things the same, and that's where we bring in all the stories like the Quibi example, and that's just one. That's an organization that tried to do something. We bring in obviously tons of stories around these massive organizations that we all likely know of that didn't spend the right amount of time thinking about death and disruption in terms of their business model, and they paid the price, right? Kodak and many others, right? That just said, nah, we don't have the bandwidth, we don't have the desire, we don't have the initiative, we don't have the mindset to do this. And so we're trying to help organizations, trying to challenge their thinking, trying to, through education, say, look, let's do it differently, right? Let's help you do it differently. It does have to be a bottom-down, a top-down, bottom-up approach, right? We need to have both sides really engaged. And so I get that there's no straight answer. It may not be a satisfying answer. And I'd love to just see if anyone else in the room has any experience with that. And what have you seen effective? What have you seen work? Perhaps even not work, and what can we learn from that?
I might just jump in here, and I see also that Karen has her hand raised, but just a quick comment. Just a few months back, we had a presentation also here from Innovationsledanra, where I had the opportunity to share a research project that I did and some of the work I have been doing with corporate boards. So how to work, in this case, it was specific around AI, implementation of AI, but I think that this is valid for innovation in general. In Sweden, the head of the board is not the CEO, is a chairman, is a third party, and we were just asking here in Innovationsledanra, do you even know who is the board in your business? Do you reach out to them? Have you tried to just go and ask, just how do you feel about innovation, and where do you stand, and what can we do about it? So just some ideas here around also reaching out to the board. Karin, and then we also have Stefan, and some questions coming up in the chat. Karin, do you want to take it away?
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Karin Winroth, and I'm both an academic and a consultant in corporate culture. And thank you, Andy, for a very interesting and fascinating presentation. I was thinking about there are in some professional culture where I've been studying or being part of, innovation is sort of built into the system. One very fascinating place is that it's a trader among the investment banks, for instance. They are sort of the CEOs and all the administration or the management of the firm just back off, and as long as they just make revenue, they're allowed, and do it legally, they're allowed to play around. They even talk about it as an experimental site or a research lab, and every day they also have the results because they sort of usually can measure how much money they've done. And I think also in some professions it's been very, very obvious. I've been studying law, which is lawyers which are very, very conservative, but still they've been around for a long time, and they've been very, very good at sort of experimenting and creating new markets for themselves. And just about 15 years ago, the financial market exploded, and they started doing M&As, which is quite another kind of work for them, but still they benefit. It's very, very financially rewarding. So there, in some aspects, it is possible. It's been built into the system, but also just connecting to Pontus' question there about sort of the CEOs have the notions to back off and let them sort of experiment. And I think, isn't that a little bit part of Google as well, that they're sort of they want them to spend time in innovation and have pre-mind and take away the blockers.
Absolutely, absolutely, Karen. It's such a great point, and thank you so much for that context as well. This is, I think, the ideal, right? Is when the senior leadership can embrace that to whatever degree they're able to say, yeah, I want to just open the floor, enable people to explore ideas, give them the resource. And again, that resource is cash and time, perhaps most critically time, to do this work. And then we're going to celebrate failure. You bring in Google, which is such a great example of that, where they very proactively and intentionally celebrate failure. Not just if it happens, we'll be okay with it. It's, hey, everybody, let's crack a bottle of champagne. We failed at this idea, right? And let's quantify for a minute what we avoided, right? By not going forward and continuing to invest all of our time and resource, or not all, but some, into this idea. Here's what we saved ourselves. And I think that, we do that in a very demonstrable way. It is so fundamental to the culture because, we respond by what we see, right? And so when leaders are getting up and, we say about this for every capacity, right? I think about leaders need to model a lot of the things that the rest of the organization is going to feel okay doing. And so if we just say, yeah, it's okay to fail, but then there's no real evidence, there's no demonstrated evidence of how that's okay, people are going to go, yeah, sure. I don't know. This feels like a setup. I'm not going to do it, right? Or, maybe not quite that intentional, but so I absolutely agree. I think that is the ideal. That is the model that many of the leading organizations are starting to really embrace. And to your point, Karen, it's such a good one to say, in these industries that have been around forever, right? And so, there's an opportunity there to do things differently. I work here as an executive coach as well. And one of my clients is one of the biggest bakeries in Canada now, and they disrupted the baking industry. And that just seems impossible. It's like baking is, it's been around forever. What could you possibly do differently? And they managed a way, taking a particular mindset, very entrepreneurial, and now they're a multi-billion-dollar bakery, which is unbelievable. Thank you so much for that. I know there's a few other raised hands.
I think it was Stefan and then Andrea.
Yeah, thank you, Andy, for an inspiration talk, and I'm a big fan of Alexander. So I just want to ask you, when it comes to different cultures, as China, you mentioned Ping An insurance company, is how does corporate cultures play out in different national cultures? I just want to hear your opinion about that. Thank you.
Yeah, you always, I think, have to be sensitive to all of the inputs, right, that happen within any political environment, right? And a political environment happens as soon as you have two people, right? And so there's so many things that are informing the way that we show up. And there's some universality to it as well, right? Like if we look at, again, I think this is what's so powerful about the tools, because if we take the concepts of what are the behaviors that we agree need to happen to enable innovation, and what are the outcomes, right? And we can do that anyway, right? We can start with outcomes. Outcomes typically the easiest thing to wrap our minds around. And then the enablers and blockers, those are concepts that play, again, universally, right? Then we put it into the environment in which we're trying to operate. And then we respond to, okay, well, in this culture, and particularly in an organization that is multinational, right? But now we have to appreciate okay, this approach could be anything from the structure to the tonality of how we go about it needs to shift and change a little bit. The speed, the pace, again, I treasure this experience because I'm Canadian. I grew up here in Canada, although my family is actually South American, so I have some connection there. But then working in a European space, I've really grown an appreciation for the nuance of how things can shift and change when you go into different cultures. And so there's a real need to stay, just as we talk about an open and growth mindset around the core structures, there is a need to say we remain open to the ways in which the culture of that organization, it's not certainly not the organization, but the country itself or the space itself, how they operate and how they may influence. So again, I think that coming back to that core piece, the universality of the tools, really helps create a rallying point around the approach. I don't know if that makes sense, Stefan, and I would love to hear your insights and what you've seen. It's obviously a burning question for you. What's your experience with it?
Thank you for a good answer. I can present you for the Swedish Bakery Association if you want to come over. So
awesome. Great, that'd be great.
Thank you. That's a good answer. Thank you very much.
And I think Andrea was next.
Yeah, thank you so much. I wanted to share with you that just a few years ago, in my company, which is like big public company, we did not speak about innovation, and everybody was like refusing, and like that was normal because CEO, CIO, everybody was like lawyers, economists, and then this thing about technology and digital innovation, it was kind of scary. It's not where they belong. They're not native in all those questions. But today we have our division. We want to make it profession, exactly as you told us, and it's what we are trying to do. And we made great success, I think. That one thing helped us a lot. In Sweden, we have different type of documents and recommendations that Swedish government gave us. We have digitalization strategy. We have documents from government that they say, like, we want to be world's best country when it comes to using digital technology. Then we have a lot of other tools that government gave us, and that we see, okay, government want us to come to next level, to work with innovation. And that was how, for example, I was motivating my leaders to make this step. I don't know about all the other countries, but I used to listen Barack Obama on artificial intelligence and some other politicians worldwide. So in Sweden, we have really great privilege. We have such a great preconditions. So that's what it's actually my tips to watch what was like government want us to do. Yeah.
What a terrific point, Andrea. Thank you so much for sharing that. There's this great advantage in the sort of the transitive property of a broader sort of institution kind of almost forcing it, right? So you can say, look, it's not me, right? It's, we're trying to respond to what we're being mandated to do. And that potentially opens the door for this work of now not forcing people to do it. And I think that's really important, because you force people, it's very time limited, right? Eventually that creates too much stress and it ultimately breaks. But then to open the door, to start the conversation, to then start to enable the why, what's really good about doing this for people so that they can embrace it. So we enroll people in it rather than push people in it, but it could potentially be a great starter. So what a good point. Stefan?
Yeah, I was wondering if you have any opinion about how much easier, if it is easier, is it to get a innovative culture when there's a sense of urgency versus when there's not a sense of urgency. Everybody knows that this is a good thing. We should probably do it. We could evolve our business and do much better things. But I suspect there's a difference between how easy it is to reach the executives and so forth when there's a sense of urgency.
What a terrific point. And what's that old saying, necessity is the mother of all invention, right? And I guess you could just replace that with innovation. And so exact same concept. I think what the guidance is try to get ahead of it. And so what I know we're trying to do, and many others are trying to do, is to share out those stories, because like we've all experienced, I think, even in a micro level or in a macro level in our own lives, it's a different it's a different thing when we're trying to respond, when we're in respond mode to something, right? That's created an urgency. And oftentimes that works. It certainly works to get us going, without a doubt, right? Because now we're really responding. But if we're doing this in a bit of an elevated sort of anxiety, or, you know, we're in a defensive posture, I guess is ultimately it. And so the thinking is, where can we imagine ourselves in that position now when we're not in it, and we don't have any elements of emotional response or urgency or banks breathing down our neck or whatever the case may be. And so how do we get ahead of it? And that's so much of what we're talking about, is saying, when you take that portfolio management approach and you really embrace this notion that we continue to execute on our current business model with this notion that, hey, this business model could be disrupted tomorrow, right? And that becoming more and more prevalent. We're seeing examples of that across the board. I'll go back to this bakery example here locally. Just yesterday, it was announced that this group has purchased the largest and oldest baking company in Canada, Weston Foods. Galen Weston, the whole family, is a very famous, well-known family here in Canada, one of the richest families, of course. And they've just been fully disrupted by this group of, this actually two brothers, young guys, and I don't even think they're in their 40s. And they have completely disrupted the market and have now acquired this organization. I think that it worked out, but there's many instances where it doesn't, right? And so if you respond in that moment of urgency and it works out, that's great. It's, again, the theory is maybe there's opportunity to get ahead of it and be proactive rather than be defensive.
Thanks.
Andy, I have here some thoughts around mapping, actually, the exercise of having the self-awareness and the criticality to look at oneself, one's own organization, and be able to map something with a certain degree of distance over it. At least my experience is, when you are working in an organization, you get so kind of caught up in it that it's really difficult to be, objective. And a lot of the organizations I worked on, if you would honestly think, okay, is this good or bad? They would think it's great. And sometimes I feel I've talked about this with other people working in innovation, which is sometimes it's almost like they're the black sheep, because they're the ones that are always talking about, the doomsday, there's a day that we are going to, fail and stop being relevant, just like the bakery example that you were giving. And instead of being positive sources of energy, sometimes innovation practitioners are the critical ones, the ones that keep complaining, that keep saying, we could be better. I don't know if you have some thoughts around that.
Yeah, so I think it's a terrific point to say, how are we managing our own mindset and how are we approaching it? I think that there are elements that we would need, I think, another whole session to talk about, and I would love to, about emotional intelligence, right? It's actually something that I focus on as well, and how well we understand our own, how we show up, how we react to inputs, and then how do we express ourselves in those moments, right? And so much of it, I think, is enabled by an ability to stop and reframe, right? So to kind of zoom out a little bit and try to maintain the bigger picture perspective, I think is really important when we think about self-awareness, because it's so easy for us to get caught and be triggered by experiences, particularly as we're working in large corporate spaces. It's easy to get, frustrated and fatigued by things that don't work and bureaucracy and so on, and get so zeroed in and laser focused on one thing. And to be able to stop and say, wait, let me put this back on balance, right? To create like a wheel of balance when we think about all of the different elements that come to bear in my own life, the things that I get caught up in and potentially lose focus on. And so I think that there's something to be said about that. And I also think there's something to be said about focusing on the negative. I think there's a lot of power in doing that. When we proactively think about what could possibly go wrong, that really gives us a tool to be ready as things potentially do go wrong. right? Because if we kind of stick our head in the sand, as that visual we saw earlier, then we're caught off guard, right? And so I think about that actually, not just in a professional capacity, but certainly in a personal capacity. I think there's, so it's kind of very personal to me, but I think that there's a lot of value and strength in the philosophy of envisioning the worst case scenario. So on a personal level, so really spending time thinking about it. And then the follow-on thought is certainly the notion of it is never to then get sunk into negative thinking. The follow-on thought is, okay, that isn't happening right now. So what can I do right now to make the most of this moment of my life, whatever the case may be? Taking that exact same thinking and applying it into a professional space is just as powerful. So what is the worst case scenario that can happen to us? Okay, let's really think about that. Let's actually maybe even role play. Let's envision it happening so we can have a visceral reaction to it. Then let's reframe and say, okay, that isn't happening. What are we doing right now so that we're optimizing every moment of our, corporate growth or whatever the case may be? It's the same structure, the same concept. So I think it's such an important thing because it's, organizations are obviously just a collection of people, right? And if the people don't have the right mindset and the right sort of energy level, it's very difficult for that organization to thrive, right?
Super, thank you. Great question. I have in my watch that we have 1 more minute. And if I just may squeeze in 30 seconds, where do you feel that the innovation manager profession is going? How do you feel about this professionalization of this activity? Do you see it happening? Do you feel that this is actually taking place? Do you have any thoughts around it?
If you're posing the question to me, I will say I think that it's definitely going in the right direction. I'm also aware of my filter, right? Because I'm immersed in this space. So it seems to me that everyone's talking about innovation, but that's because all my feeds and everything is designed towards this. But if we really zoom out and we look at organizations, absolutely, the biggest companies that we're working with are absolutely embracing innovation as a critical part, as a proactive part of their strategic guidance, and they're understanding the need to balance that with top-down, bottom-up approach. So we're absolutely seeing it. It's not just a feeling. We're seeing that out there in the space. And so I think there's a lot of positives. And the fact that we've got technology, of course, people talk about digital transformation on this call as a real enabler of all of this. It's pushing the organization to, Stefan, to your point, saying, creating this urgency for large organizations. And they're looking around and going, hey, like my peers in this space have either been disrupted or are very much at the risk of, why aren't I? I am. And so let me get into doing some work to get ahead of it. So I think we're absolutely on the right trajectory.
Super, thank you.
Thank you.
It's 3:30. I think it's time for us to unfortunately move on. It was a pleasure, Andy, to have you with us, a real honor. And it was a great presentation, so much food for thought. Well, I invite everyone that was in the call, including you, Andy, if you want to join our innovation program, please be aware that the application is until the end of the year. Thank you so much, everyone, and see you in the next meetings, in the next events.
Thank you so much for everything, Fernanda. People, please, I'm on LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions or want to engage in more conversation. I'm more than happy to. Thank you so much.
Thank you.